The sea stretched endlessly before him, its vastness mirroring the ache in his chest. John Foster stood on the deck of the Endeavour, the merchant ship that had been both his workplace and his prison for the past 10 months. The creak of the ship's hull and the rhythmic slap of the waves were constants now, the background noise of a life spent far from the people he loved most. 10 months ago, when he'd taken this contract, he'd thought of it as a means to an end, a way to provide for his wife, Sarah, and the future they were building together. The money was good, the work steady, and though it meant leaving Woodridge for a year, Sarah had been supportive. "We'll get through this," she'd said, holding his hands tightly on the day he left. "We always do." Her words had been a balm then, but now, standing under the open sky with the wind whipping around him, John felt the weight of their distance more acutely than ever. Letters from home were his lifeline, each one a glimpse into the world he'd left behind. Sarah wrote to him faithfully, her words spilling across the page in looping script that seemed to bring her voice to life. At first, her letters were filled with the ordinary details of their life, the neighbor's new dog that wouldn't stop barking, the fence in the backyard that needed repairs, the book club she'd joined to pass the time. But 5 months into his journey, the tone of her letters began to change. "John," she had written in early June, "I have some news that I hope will make you as happy as it's made me. I'm pregnant. Can you believe it? We're going to have a baby." John had stared at the letter for hours, reading and rereading the words. Pregnant. A baby. It was news he'd always dreamed of, yet its timing struck an odd chord. They hadn't been trying before he left, had they? He tried to remember the hurried goodbyes, the tender moments they'd shared before his departure. Perhaps it had been one of those fleeting nights when life seemed too full of possibilities to consider practicalities. Still, the news brought joy. It carried him through the grueling hours of work on the ship, the monotony of endless days at sea. Sarah's subsequent letters were filled with updates on her pregnancy, the cravings she joked about, the nursery she was setting up with help from Mark, John's younger brother. "Mark's been such a lifesaver," one letter read. "He's been here every weekend, helping me paint the nursery and fix up the house. I don't know what I'd do without him." John had felt a pang of guilt then. Of course Mark would step up, that's the kind of man he was. But it didn't stop John from wishing he could be there himself, to share in the excitement and shoulder the burden of preparing for their first child. By the 8th month of his journey, Sarah's updates became less frequent. "It's harder to write now," she explained in her last letter. "The babies are so active, and I'm so tired. But I can't wait for you to meet them. Just a little longer now." Babies. The plural hadn't escaped him. John had reread the line over and over. Had it been a typo? A slip of the pen? But before he could dwell on it too long, the cruise mail service was disrupted by a storm, cutting off his lifeline to home for nearly 2 months. When communication resumed, the letter that reached him was short but seismic. "John, they're here. Triplets. Born healthy and strong. I wish you could have been here. We're all doing fine and can't wait for you to come home to meet your family." The letter was dated a month prior, meaning the birth had occurred 10 months into his journey. John froze, the math playing out in his mind like a cruel equation he couldn't escape. Triplets born at 10 months meant conception had occurred 1 month after he'd set sail. 1 month after he'd said goodbye. The realization hit him like a wave crashing over the bow of the ship, leaving him breathless and reeling. He tried to reason it away, late labor, perhaps. A mistake in the dates. But deep down, an insidious doubt began to creep in, tightening its grip around his chest. The timeline didn't add up. John spent the rest of the voyage in a haze, the camaraderie of the crew and the routine of the work offering little solace. Every night, he stared at the ceiling of his cramped cabin, his thoughts racing in circles. He wanted to believe in Sarah, in the love they'd built together. But the unease refused to be silenced. By the time the ship docked in New York, John had made a decision. He would go home and meet the children. He would hold them, love them, and be the father they deserved. But first, he would need the truth. The plane touched down on a rainy afternoon, gray skies casting a pall over John Foster's homecoming. He stared out the window as the airport loomed closer, the engine's hum fading into the static of his thoughts. His mind was a battlefield of emotions, excitement, dread, and an anger he couldn't quite name. The letter had left too many questions unanswered. For weeks, John had pored over Sarah's words, dissecting every sentence, every date. He tried to dismiss his doubts as paranoia, the kind that festered during long months of separation. But the math didn't lie. He couldn't shake the fact that the triplets had been conceived a month after his departure. Now, as he made his way through the terminal, duffel bag in hand, a single question burned in his mind: why? The drive to Woodridge was uneventful, the familiar countryside blurred by rain streaking down the car windows. John clutched the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. Memories of the life he'd left behind played in his head like an old reel: Sunday mornings with Sarah on the porch, dinners with Mark where laughter had flowed freely. They felt like relics of another life, one that was slipping further from his grasp with every mile. As he pulled into the driveway, the house came into view, its lights glowing warmly against the stormy sky. The sight stirred something in him, a yearning for normalcy, for the comfort of the world he'd built with Sarah. But beneath it, the doubt churned, a dark current pulling him under. The front door opened before he could knock. Sarah stood there, a smile breaking across her face, her arms outstretched. "John," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're home." He let her embrace him, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender and something faintly floral, something new. She pulled back, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and he forced a smile. "Good to be back," he said. Her face lit up. "Come inside. There's someone waiting to meet you." As he stepped into the house, the sound of soft cooing reached his ears. Sarah led him to the living room, where a large bassinet sat near the couch. "There they are," she said, her voice a mix of pride and wonder. "Emma, Luke, and Ella." John approached slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The triplets were perfect: round cheeks, tiny fists, and soft tufts of dark hair. They lay nestled together, their little movements synchronized like a symphony. "They're beautiful," he murmured, his voice tight. "They've been such a blessing," Sarah said, kneeling beside the bassinet. "Every day, I think about how lucky we are." Her words landed heavily, and John's jaw tightened. Lucky. Was that how she saw it? His chest tightened with unspoken accusations, but he forced them down, his expression neutral. "How was the trip?" Sarah asked as they settled on the couch. "Long," he replied. "Tiring. But I'm glad to be home. And we're so glad to have you back." She reached for his hand, her touch warm and familiar. "You'll love being a dad. I know it's a lot to take in, but you'll get the hang of it." "Dad." The word cut through him like a knife. The days that followed were a blur of diaper changes, feedings, and endless crying. John threw himself into fatherhood with a quiet determination, his doubts festering beneath the surface. Sarah seemed overjoyed to have him home, her laughter ringing through the house as she showed him the routines she'd perfected. But John noticed the small things, the way she avoided his eyes when he asked about her pregnancy, the slight hesitation in her answers. And then there was Mark. He arrived on the second day, carrying a bag of groceries and wearing his usual easy grin. "Big brother," Mark said, pulling John into a hug. "Good to have you back, man." "Good to be back," John replied, his tone measured. Mark turned his attention to the bassinet, crouching to coo at the triplets. They seemed to respond to him instantly, their tiny faces lighting up. "They missed their favorite uncle," Mark said, winking at Sarah. "Didn't you, little ones?" John watched the scene unfold, his unease deepening. Mark moved through the house with a familiarity that made John's skin crawl, grabbing a bottle from the fridge without asking, adjusting the nursery's mobile as if it were his own. "You've been around a lot," John said casually as they stood in the kitchen later. "Someone had to hold down the fort," Mark replied, popping open a soda. "Sarah needed help. You know how it is." John nodded, biting back the questions that clawed at his throat. The turning point came late one night. John had just finished putting the triplets to bed when he found Sarah sitting in the study, sorting through a stack of old photos. "What's this?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Just memories," she said, smiling faintly. "Trying to make room for all the baby pictures we're going to have." John stepped closer, his eyes scanning the photos spread across the desk. One caught his attention, a snapshot of Sarah and Mark in the nursery, both of them laughing as they painted the walls. "When was this?" he asked, his voice tight. "About 7 months ago," Sarah replied, not looking up. John's stomach churned. He studied her profile, the way her brows furrowed as she worked. This was Sarah, his Sarah. The woman he had loved for years. Yet in this moment, she felt like a stranger. "Sarah," he said, his voice low. "I've been thinking a lot about the timeline." She froze, her hands stilling over the photos. "The triplets," he continued. "They were conceived about a month after I left." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Sarah's eyes flicked up to meet his, wide and unblinking. "John," she began, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think." "What should I think?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Tell me, Sarah. Because right now, I don't know what to believe." She looked away, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. "You've been gone for so long. I thought." Her words faltered, and John felt his anger rising like a tide. "You thought what?" he demanded. "That I wouldn't notice. That I wouldn't ask questions." The triplets' cries broke through the tension, and Sarah bolted from the room, leaving John alone with the weight of her unfinished sentence. As he stood there, his mind racing, one thing became clear: the truth would not come easily. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the baby monitor on the nightstand. John lay awake, staring at the darkened ceiling, his mind racing. Sarah had retreated to bed hours ago, exhausted after another chaotic day of caring for the triplets. Her even breathing should have been a comfort, a reminder of the life they had built together. Instead, it felt like a wall, a barrier between him and the answers he desperately needed. The conversation in the study had left him shaken. Sarah's hesitance, her vague answers, had only deepened his suspicions. There was something she wasn't telling him, and he couldn't rest until he knew what it was. John rolled over, careful not to disturb her, and reached for his phone. The paternity test he had ordered arrived in his thoughts like a lifeline. Quietly, he slipped out of bed and padded down the hall to the nursery. The triplets were sound asleep, their soft breaths creating a rhythm that seemed to calm the storm inside him. He hesitated for a moment, guilt gnawing at the edges of his resolve. These were his children, weren't they? The ones he had dreamed of holding since Sarah's first letter announcing her pregnancy. But the timeline wouldn't leave him alone. 10 months away, 3 babies conceived a month after his departure, it was a cruel puzzle with too many missing pieces. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the monitor's hum. With steady hands, John collected the samples, following the instructions he had memorized earlier. A quick swab of each baby's cheek, a careful seal of the evidence in the provided envelopes. The process took minutes, but it felt like hours. As he sealed the package for mailing, his stomach churned. Whatever the results revealed, they would change everything. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. John threw himself into the routines of fatherhood, masking his unease with the precision of someone used to compartmentalizing his emotions. He fed the triplets, rocked them to sleep, even found himself laughing at their tiny quirks. But at night, when the house was quiet and Sarah's laughter had faded into her dreams, the doubt crept back in. Mark's visits didn't help. He was there more often than not, breezing through the front door with a casual familiarity that grated on John's nerves. Mark always had a reason, dropping off groceries, helping with repairs, bringing takeout on nights Sarah was too tired to cook. "I'm just trying to help, big bro," Mark said one evening as they stood on the porch. He took a long sip from his beer, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You've been around a lot," John said, keeping his tone neutral. Mark shrugged. "Sarah needed someone. You weren't here." The words landed like a slap, though Mark's tone was light. John stared at his brother, searching his face for any hint of malice, any crack in the easygoing mask he wore so effortlessly. "I appreciate it," John said finally, forcing the words out. "Hey, that's what family's for." Mark clapped him on the shoulder, his grin widening. "You do the same for me." John said nothing, watching as Mark sauntered back inside. His gut twisted. The results arrived in a nondescript envelope a week later. John found it in the mailbox, buried beneath bills and advertisements. He stood on the porch, staring at the return address. His hands shook as he tore it open. The words were clinical, devoid of emotion, but their meaning hit him like a freight train. Probability of paternity, 0%. John sank onto the porch steps, the paper trembling in his hands. The triplets weren't his. He read the report again, his eyes scanning the cold, scientific language as if looking for a mistake. But there was no mistake. The test had confirmed what his gut had been telling him all along. Mark. The name surfaced unbidden, a shadow cast over every memory of the past 10 months. John clenched his fists, his mind racing through every interaction, every casual smile, every knowing glance. It all led back to him. The front door creaked open, and Sarah stepped out. "John," she said, her voice cautious. "What's wrong?" He looked up at her, his face a mask of controlled fury. For a moment, he thought about confronting her then and there, laying the results in her lap and demanding the truth. But something stopped him. "Nothing," he said, his voice flat. He stood, tucking the envelope into his pocket. "Just some work stuff." Sarah frowned, but she didn't press him. "Dinner's ready," she said softly. "I'll be there in a minute," John replied. As she disappeared back inside, John turned his gaze to the horizon. The storm inside him had quieted, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. He needed proof, not just of Mark's betrayal, but of Sarah's complicity. He needed to know exactly how deep the lies went. And when he had the truth, he would decide what to do with it. The days that followed were a study in quiet observation. John Foster moved through his house like a shadow, his every action deliberate, his every word measured. Sarah, oblivious to the turmoil beneath his calm exterior, continued about her days with the efficiency of a mother juggling 3 newborns. To anyone looking in, they might have seemed like the perfect family. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming, their edges sharp and dangerous. John's anger simmered just below boiling, but he held it in check. He wasn't ready to confront Sarah, not yet. He needed more. More evidence. More certainty. A confrontation without answers would only lead to more questions, and John wasn't prepared for half-truths or excuses. The envelope with the paternity results sat in the back of his desk drawer, buried beneath old receipts and unused stationery. Every time he opened the drawer, his eyes lingered on it, the words burned into his memory, probability of paternity, 0%. There was no denying the truth. The triplets weren't his. But how had it happened? Mark's name was a constant presence in his thoughts, a specter haunting every corner of the house. The man who had promised to look after Sarah. The man who had been there when John couldn't be. The man who had crossed a line no brother should ever cross. It started with a photo. Late one night, after Sarah and the babies had gone to bed, John sat in the study, scrolling through her old social media posts. He told himself it was innocent, just a way to understand what he had missed during his time away. But deep down, he was searching for something. And then he found it. A picture from 8 months ago, posted by Mark. It showed him and Sarah in the nursery, painting the walls a soft shade of yellow. Sarah was laughing, her face turned toward Mark, who held a paint roller and grinned at the camera. The caption read, "Making a space for the little ones. Couldn't have done it without this amazing mom-to-be." John stared at the photo, his heart pounding. The familiarity in their body language, the ease with which they stood together, it was too much. He clicked through more posts, his unease growing with each one. Mark had been a constant presence during Sarah's pregnancy. Pictures of them shopping for baby clothes. Updates about how Mark had saved the day by fixing a leaking pipe in the kitchen. And then there was the one that made his blood run cold. It was a picture of a sonogram, the grainy black and white image announcing the presence of triplets. The post was from 7 months ago, and the caption read, "Can't wait to meet these little miracles. They're going to have the best uncle ever." Uncle. John closed the laptop with a sharp snap, his hands trembling. The pieces were falling into place, each one more damning than the last. The next morning, John left the house early. He told Sarah he was running errands, but his destination was clear. Mark's house was a modest bungalow on the other side of town. John had been there countless times before, but today it felt different. The front lawn was neatly trimmed, the porch swept clean, a picture of normalcy. John parked across the street, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. Confronting Mark wasn't part of the plan, yet. He wasn't ready for that conversation. But he couldn't sit idle any longer. When Mark left for work, John followed him, keeping a safe distance. He felt a twinge of guilt at the thought of tailing his own brother, but the guilt was quickly swallowed by anger. Mark's car led him to a small diner on the edge of town. John parked a few spaces away and watched as Mark entered, his easygoing demeanor unchanged. John waited. Minutes passed, then 20. Finally, Mark emerged, but he wasn't alone. A woman followed him, blonde, tall, and laughing at something Mark had said. She placed a hand on his arm, and the gesture sent a fresh wave of anger surging through John. They stood beside Mark's car, talking animatedly. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but John committed every detail to memory. When they parted ways, Mark climbed into his car and drove off, leaving the woman standing in the parking lot. John hesitated, then stepped out of his car. "Excuse me," he called, crossing the lot. The woman turned, her expression curious. "Hi," John said, his voice even. "Do you know Mark Foster?" Her smile faded, replaced by a cautious look. "Yes." "Why?" "I'm his brother," John said, extending a hand. "John Foster." The woman shook his hand reluctantly. "Melissa." "Nice to meet you," John said. "I'm just curious. How do you know Mark?" Melissa hesitated, glancing toward the diner. "We work together." "Why?" John forced a smile. "No reason. Just trying to catch up. Haven't seen him much since I got back." She nodded, but her expression remained guarded. "Well, nice meeting you, John. I've got to get going." As she walked away, John felt no closer to the answers he sought. But the interaction left a sour taste in his mouth. Mark wasn't just a brother anymore, he was a man with secrets. That night, John sat alone in the study, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. The lies, the half-truths, they were suffocating. He opened the drawer, pulling out the envelope with the paternity results. The paper felt heavy in his hands, its words final and unyielding. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, I'll confront him. But even as he made the decision, a voice in the back of his mind whispered, "Are you ready for what you'll find?" The morning air was heavy with anticipation, the sky painted in muted grays as if nature itself was bracing for what was to come. John Foster sat in his car, parked outside Mark's bungalow. The engine was off, the keys clutched tightly in his hand. He stared at the house, its unassuming facade now a battleground in his mind. Today was the day. The paternity results burned a hole in his pocket. He had read them countless times, the clinical words etched into his memory. None of the triplets were his. None. The truth sat heavy on his chest, suffocating him. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Mark opened the door with his usual grin, but it faltered when he saw John standing there. "Hey, big bro," Mark said, his tone cautious. "Didn't expect to see you here so early. Everything okay?" John stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His movements were deliberate, his jaw set. "We need to talk," John said, his voice low. Mark shut the door, the grin fading completely. "All right. What's going on?" John turned to face him, his eyes hard. "You tell me, Mark. What's been going on while I've been away?" Mark's brow furrowed, his confusion feigned, or so it seemed to John. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've been helping Sarah out, like I said I would." "What's this about?" John pulled the envelope from his pocket and held it up. "This is what it's about." Mark took a step back, his face pale. "What is that?" "A paternity test," John said, his voice like ice. "I had one done on the triplets." Mark's mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence was damning. "You knew, didn't you?" John said, his voice rising. "You knew they weren't mine." Mark raised his hands, his voice shaking. "John, listen." "No." John snapped, his anger boiling over. "You don't get to explain this away." Not this time. Mark's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. I didn't mean for it to happen, Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. John stared at him, his fists clenched. Then how? Explain it to me, Mark. How do you accidentally betray your own brother? Mark looked up, his eyes filled with regret, or was it guilt? She was lonely, John. You were gone for months, and she needed someone. I was there, and things got out of hand. Out of hand? John's voice cracked with disbelief. You slept with my wife, Mark. You fathered her children. I know I messed up, Mark said, his voice pleading. I know I've ruined everything. But it wasn't just me. Sarah. John cut him off, his tone sharp. Don't you dare try to blame her for this. Mark held his gaze, his expression earnest. I'm not blaming her, but you deserve the full truth. She came to me, John. She needed someone, and I didn't know how to say no. John turned away, his chest heaving. The weight of Mark's words pressed down on him, threatening to break him. You didn't know how to say no. John repeated, his voice bitter. You knew exactly what you were doing. You've always known. Mark stood, his voice rising. I'm not proud of it, all right. But it's done, John. The triplets are here, and they're innocent in all of this. John spun around, his eyes blazing. Don't you dare talk to me about innocence. You stole my family, Mark. You took everything I trusted and burned it to the ground. The room fell silent, the tension thick and suffocating. Mark looked away, unable to meet John's gaze. What do you want me to do? Mark asked finally, his voice small. John laughed, the sound hollow and bitter. What do I want you to do? You can't undo this, Mark. You can't fix what you've broken. Mark took a hesitant step forward. John, please. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. John's jaw tightened, his anger giving way to something colder. You can't make this right, Mark. But I'll tell you what you're going to do. You're going to stay away from Sarah. From the triplets. From me. You don't exist to us anymore. Mark's face crumpled, but he didn't argue. And if you ever try to contact Sarah or come near my house again, John continued, his voice deadly calm, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are. Mark nodded, his shoulders sagging. I understand. John turned and walked toward the door, his heart heavy but his resolve firm. As he stepped outside, the weight on his chest lifted, if only slightly. For the first time in months, he felt in control. But as he drove away, one question lingered in his mind, what would he do about Sarah? John Foster sat on the edge of the bed in the house that had once been his sanctuary. The nursery down the hall was silent, the triplets finally asleep after a day of endless cries and feedings. The room was dim, lit only by the pale glow of the bedside lamp, its warmth unable to chase away the chill that had settled in his chest. He held the envelope in his hands, the now familiar paternity results inside. He had read them so many times that the words felt carved into his mind. Probability of paternity, 0%. Sarah entered the room, her face lined with exhaustion. She paused in the doorway, watching him. Are you coming to bed? John didn't answer. He turned the envelope over in his hands, his movements slow and deliberate. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. I talked to Mark. Sarah's face went pale, her hand tightening on the doorframe. What did he say? John looked up at her, his eyes heavy with pain. He told me the truth. About the triplets. About you and him. She took a step into the room, her voice trembling. John, I can explain. Don't, he said sharply, his tone like a blade. Don't insult me with excuses. Sarah froze, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't supposed to happen. I never meant to hurt you. You didn't just hurt me, John said, rising to his feet. His voice cracked, anger and despair warring within him. You destroyed us. Our life. Our family. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she took another step closer. I made a mistake. I was lonely, and Mark, he was there. But it didn't mean anything, John. You're the one I love. John laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Love? You call this love? You slept with my brother. You had his children and lied to me about it. That's not love, Sarah. That's betrayal. Her sobs filled the room, but John's heart had hardened. He had spent months drowning in doubt, questioning himself, questioning his family. Now the truth was out, and it was a bitter relief. I wanted to believe you, John said, his voice quieter now. I wanted to believe that we could get through anything. But there's no coming back from this. Sarah sank to her knees, her hands clasped together in desperation. Please, John. Please don't leave us. The triplets need you. I need you. John looked at her, his expression unreadable. They're not mine, Sarah. No matter how much I love them, they'll always be a reminder of what you and Mark did. Her sobs grew louder, but John turned away, his decision made. He had spent too long trying to hold together a life that was already shattered. The next morning, John packed his bags in silence. The house was eerily quiet, Sarah's tear-streaked face watching him from the doorway as he carried the last suitcase to his car. Where will you go? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John paused, his hand on the car door. I don't know. But I can't stay here. She nodded, fresh tears sliding down her cheeks. I'm sorry, John. For everything. He looked at her, his expression softening for the briefest moment. Take care of them, Sarah. They didn't ask for this. With that, he climbed into the car and drove away, the weight of his decision settling over him like a heavy cloak. The house disappeared in the rearview mirror, but the pain lingered, a constant reminder of what he had lost. Months passed. John settled in a small apartment on the edge of town, his life reduced to the bare essentials. He worked long hours, filling his days with anything that kept his mind busy. But at night, when the world was quiet, the memories crept back in. He thought of the triplets, their tiny hands, their innocent smiles. He thought of Sarah, her laughter, her touch, the way she had once made him feel invincible. And he thought of Mark, the brother who had stolen everything he held dear. Sometimes, he would drive past the house, parking a block away where he couldn't be seen. He would watch as Sarah played with the triplets in the yard, their laughter carried on the wind. They looked happy, untouched by the storm that had torn their family apart. But John knew he couldn't be a part of that happiness. One cold winter evening, John sat alone in his apartment, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The room was dark, the only light coming from the city outside his window. He stared into the glass, the amber liquid reflecting his hollow expression. For all his anger, all his pain, he couldn't escape the truth, he still loved them. Sarah, the triplets, even Mark, in some twisted, complicated way. But love wasn't enough to undo the betrayal, to erase the scars. As the snow fell softly outside, John raised the glass in a silent toast. To what could have been, he whispered. And then, he drank. What would you do if your entire life unraveled like this? Could you forgive, or is walking away the only choice? Share your thoughts below.